This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Welcome back, everyone, to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. I am your host, Tony Black, this week, and I'm joined by my co-host, Duncan Barrett.
Hi, Tony. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Duncan. I'm really pleased. We've got a third very special guest for this episode.
We have.
We have, and it's a real treat to welcome on the show award-winning writer and a bit of a Star Trek books legend, Keith R.A. DeCandido. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm a legend exactly, but I'll take it. Sure.
Well, I'd say you are. I'd say you are. And you were very gracious a couple of years ago to appear on my X-Files podcast, The X-Cast, and of course you've been on other Trek FM shows such as Literary Treks, because you're a man of fiction and you've written a multitude of Star Trek books over the years, including a book we're going to touch on today as part of a broader conversation, Articles of the Federation, which is a really big favourite amongst fandom in terms of tie-in Star Trek books and things like that. And today's topic for Primitive Culture is going to be about politics, and specifically Federation politics within Star Trek, because it's a fairly broad and fascinating topic, really. And Articles of the Federation is one of the key texts, really, that gets into what politics is in terms of this future 24th century, in this case, world, in a way that hasn't really been seen on screen, but which ties into all kinds of other kind of, modern day fiction, things like The West Wing and all kinds of movies and things like that. So I suppose the best place to start off with, really, Keith, is originally what was it that drew you to want to write about the politics of the Federation?
Well, I like writing about politics generally, so that was something that was of interest to me, at least in part. And also just one of the things that tie-in fiction is useful for is exploring things that are roads less well traveled by the source material, shall we say, and to deal with things that the original either can't or won't or just doesn't have time to deal with. And politics is one of those things. I mean, the Star Trek TV shows are all generally about Starfleet. Even Deep Space Nine, which had, lots of other non-Starfleet characters as part of the storyline, was still basically about Starfleet's presence in Bajor in this particular case. And the others are all, based on a particular starship, whether it's Enterprise or Voyager or Discovery, what have you. So the politics of the Federation is something that was never really addressed much on screen. We have gotten to see 3 different Federation presidents, and that's basically it. And there's lots of references to the Federation Council and occasional appearances by various Federation politicians, from Nils Barris on The Trouble with Tribbles all the way up through to the various presidents that we saw in the movies and on Deep Space Nine. But that was it, really. Most of the representatives of the Federation that we've seen have been Starfleet, not civilian, which is the nature of the show. It's about Starfleet crews for the most part, so that makes sense. But so I was curious to explore that in a little more depth. On top of that, I was specifically asked by one of the editors at Simon & Schuster saying, "Hey, I want you to do a Star Trek version of The West Wing. I think you could do that really well." So there was that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things that comes across in the book when you read it, is that there is that feeling of Aaron Sorkin's The West Wing captured, that level of, that sense of, fast-paced, all kinds of things happening at once in trying to balance this interstellar, federation of worlds and keep lots of plate spinning, which is what, is always happening in the West Wing. The fast-paced walks down the corridor with lots of information flying around and all kinds of bills and, political, shenanigans going on at the same time. And I think one of the things we've talked about, Duncan, as well, in thinking about this episode is why it is that Star Trek hasn't really dealt with this much in comparison to other civilizations, because we've seen loads of things going on with, the Klingon Chancellor over the years, all kinds of several different Klingon Chancellors over various shows. We've seen things at the Romulan Senate, the Romulan high powers, there seems to have been a lot more interest in alien governments and things like that than the human one, which is really strange in a way, even if it is, as Keith said, as you rightly said, it's all about crews exploring. It's like they haven't almost delved into that. And Articles was one of the first books that did, and one of the first things that did.
Well, there's that wonderful line in The Undiscovered Country, isn't there, where Spock says, basically, if we can't sort this out, then it resides in the purview of the diplomats. And the way he says it, there's a sort of undercurrent of contempt you feel in that delivery almost. I couldn't help thinking, is that a kind of, are we back to that kind of family squabbling again by this point? But, so, it may be partly what Keith, you were saying that, this is about a show essentially about Starfleet. It's about a kind of military organization, however you want to define that. And obviously the kind of relationship between the military and the kind of political side of things is a complex one. I mean, I guess we see that most clearly really in the Deep Space Nine two-parter, Homefront and Paradise Lost, where you really get this sense of kind of, the kind of diplomatic political process on the one hand with President Inyo, and then the kind of Starfleet representatives on the other hand kind of saying, look, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to beef up security, all this stuff, which, I mean, it's amazing watching that episode today and thinking that that it was actually made in the 90s and not in the 2000s, because all of those kind of issues came so much to the fore in the years after that episode was first broadcast. But I suppose it gives an insight into that sort of tension almost between the kind of the sort of military approach of Starfleet, which is primarily what we see in Star Trek, and this kind of civilian diplomatic political sphere, which obviously they're not always totally well aligned, even as they're meant to be working together.
It was interesting actually, because I'd been from 2011 to last year, basically, I was rewatching various Star Trek shows and writing about it for Tor.com. And when I got to Homefront and Paradise Lost, it was kind of, I hadn't watched those two in a while. And it was almost really spooky realizing how much more resonance that had, now than it did at the time that it aired. It was the whole idea of giving up, when something horrible happens and having to give up liberty for the illusion of security was sort of theoretical when the episodes aired in the 90s. And then after 2001, it became much more, especially, certainly for me, it became much more real just because I live in New York City. And over here in the States generally, what we went through in the early part of the millennium. But it was also frustrating, back to what you were saying a minute ago about how we got to see so much Klingon politics, so much Romulan politics and Cardassian politics and Bajoran politics. We got such in-depth looks at those governments, but never at the home one, and part of that is there was conflict with those, whereas, the Federation is kind of our side. So the only time it really did come up is when there was a conflict, which was in the case of what the founders were doing to disrupt the Federation government in Homefront and Paradise Lost. So,
but what was interesting though about Articles was as much the run up to that as the actual book. In that you were writing the A Time 2 books for the Next Generation, and you have in that this whole idea. Spoilers, and anyone who hasn't read them, just be wary of this. But you have this whole idea of the Bolian president at that time, Minzif. I don't know his name. Minzif.
It was pronounced Zeif.
Zeif. Okay, thank you. He essentially is he's brought down, because he has been lying to the people. He's been doing these, backdoor kind of, fueling a terrorist state essentially, and sending arms to this, and it parallels a lot of what has gone on in previous American, administrations. There's hints of Nixon about all of that. And it's one of those interesting things that you didn't get to see in the TV shows, but it's layered into the fabric of this, this continuing universe outside, beyond Nemesis and things like that. I mean, that must have been, even before you wrote articles, Keith, that must have been really interesting to layer in from a political perspective.
Well, that was by design. We were part of what we were doing with the A Time To series, besides just generally telling the story of what the Enterprise was doing between Insurrection and Nemesis, was also basically showing the Federation moving past the ugliness of the Dominion War and getting back to being the Federation again. There were, on DS9, we got to see a lot of the compromises that had to be made on a small scale, in terms of things like how Sisko brought the Romulans into the war and in the pale moonlight, and the cost of what they had to do, Section 31 basically committing genocide, things like that. Now that they had fought and they had won, getting themselves back into being what the Federation is supposed to be was part of what we were going towards in there. And there was also, those books were written in 2003 and 2004. So there was a certain amount of commentary on what was going on in the country at the time with the wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq, in particular with David Mack's two books, A Time to Kill and A Time to Heal, which was Dave created Minzaif for those two books. We introduced him a little sooner in the series, but he was basically Dave's creation, consulting with all of us. The A Time To project was very collaborative among the group of us who wrote it. In particular, me, Dave, and Bob Greenberger did a lot to coordinate the final 5 books in the series with each other. So we started that in Bob's 2 books, just in little bits and pieces, and then it came to the 4 in Dave's books, and then my job was to clean up the mess afterward. But we wanted to delve into, yes, we saw the Dominion War as it was fought, on the front lines with Sisko and with Admiral Ross, but there was also, who was in charge of the Federation at the time? What type of president was he or she? And so we developed the character of Zaif as well as his chief of staff, Col Azernal, and their role, and how they were the right president for the country for the Federation rather during war, because they were able to make the difficult decisions that a wartime president needs to make, but less well suited to it once it transitioned back, once the Federation, rather, I keep using country. I mean, it is a country, but still, once they transitioned back into peace, getting back onto that proved a little more difficult because of the compromises that they made during war were catching up to them.
Well, it's interesting. I think, this whole idea of the kind of legality or illegality of the president's role. And obviously, Tony's mentioned Nixon. I mean, Nixon famously had that line, if the president does it, it's not illegal. And I guess, again, going back to Star Trek 6, there's that line where the president basically, he says this president is not above the law. That's kind of laying down quite a strict, a clear line, basically saying, I'm going to go along with international law. I'm going to do everything by the book. I'm going to do everything properly and so on. But you're right. Of course, we see, in Deep Space Nine, in something like In the Pale Moonlight, we see Sisko very much kind of going outside of the law and trying to bend the rules and so on. And I suppose there's this sense, I mean, I have to say, I haven't read the A Time To books. I read articles for this week and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really fascinating look at all these kind of issues. And there's quite a lot of the kind of Min Zaif story is kind of is explained in there, I think, for someone who's kind of missed those books coming into it. But definitely it sort of raises these issues about do you want something different from a wartime president or a peacetime president? And particularly maybe if the war is not the kind of wars that we fight in the real world these days, but a war where you're potentially in danger of being completely annihilated. I mean, the situation that they're in is a difficult one. And, we see in our own history, I suppose, there are politicians who maybe come to the fore in certain circumstances. I mean, I'm thinking someone like Churchill, for example, was perhaps the right prime minister for wartime and not the right prime minister for peace, And I suppose there is that sense that different kind of personalities, different kind of approaches and so on might work better in different situations. But that's not to say that that you can really have someone who gets away with just saying, well, I can do whatever I like. And, and it doesn't matter if I'm breaking the law or not. There do have to be certain kind of standards, I suppose, that we hold these people to account. And obviously, at the moment, obviously in the United States, there's a lot of issues around this about, what are the kind of standards that you hold a president to account to? And, at what point does someone's behavior kind of create a problem, really? A kind of political problem and a kind of democratic problem, I suppose, if the president's not behaving presidentially.
And just the difference in how, how a leader shapes how a nation is responded to and how they deal with things. That was one of the things I wanted to try to do, that we tried to do with articles, and which you saw actually in particular, which you saw on Next Gen and Deep Space Nine with the various changes in power in the Klingon Empire, and on Deep Space Nine with the changes in power in the Cardassian Union, is how their leadership allowed them to be perceived. There was Cardassia in particular was a really good example of that, just because of all the different things all the upheaval they went through, in being the Obsidian Order being wiped out, which was basically half the government, how that weakened them to the point where the Klingons are able to invade, and then and the novels then continue that with in the post finale novels for Deep Space Nine, and dealing with how Cardassia is rebuilding, with several people, including Garrick, involved in the reconstruction of Cardassia. And that difference in how, and the difference between, between how the Klingon Empire was under Kimpek and how it became under Gowron, and then later under Martok, as has been mostly dealt with in the fiction, because Martok was made Chancellor at the end of the show. But even in those few episodes where Martok was Chancellor, there was a perceived difference with him in charge. There was a feeling of confidence and a better ally, basically, in the Klingons, in a more honorable ally than Gowron, who was always from the beginning an opportunist, from all the way back to when he was on Next Gen, and how that affected how the Klingon Empire was perceived, just because of that change in leadership on top. For that matter, and that goes back even to the movies with Gorkon and As It Were, and the changes that they were trying to bring about.
But if you've noticed that when you list all those examples, you're absolutely right, but they're often driven by personalities, aren't they? They're often driven by these, memorable characters. People like Gowron, who for all his faults was a really memorable character. Even when you had the massive power, coup and the shift in Romulus with Shinzon, however contentious, a film nemesis can be, and however, it divides people, Shinzon was a character, he was a very interesting character. Even though he didn't last very long. If you think about the Federation presidents we've seen, that's one of the things about articles. Nania Tobacco is one of the most interesting sort of characters. You would really like to see her characterized, on TV, because she would actually have been a really interesting, rounded president figure who you could have popped up in these TV shows at various points and functioned in a specific way. Whereas when you look at, the presidents we've seen, Jarishinyo was quite, he was quite weak in Deep Space Nine. You had the, I think it was Ra Gutra, probably hashing these names up, but Ra Gutra in the Undiscovered Country was an interesting, quite like Duncan said, quite firm, I'm not above the law kind of character, but he wasn't massively well characterized. He was more in the background. And then the guy, in the Voyage Home was like a cuddly old grandfather, when it's like, when they've got the whale probe. So, you've never really had one of these really sort of interesting and, dare I say, Terran human characters driving that political story on the Federation side, and actually appearing regularly to sort of make a mark in that way. And it's really interesting why none of the shows seem to feel that was necessary.
To have a kind of strong Federation leader, I suppose. Yeah, that's one of the things that struck me about articles, is that, you have created this great character in President Bako, who, it does feel very West Wing. She feels very much like a kind of President Bartlett type character, sort of a real kind of character, real kind of personality coming across. Whereas I think you're right, Tony, with the ones that we've seen on screen. Granted, they're only on screen briefly and so on. And in some ways it's a kind of functional role more than anything. But at the same time, it is strange in a way, really, that we haven't seen anyone to match the Gowrons or the Golducuts or the, the kind of, or the female changeling, any of these kind of these characters who, love them or hate them, there's a sense of a kind of a great leader or a kind of a charismatic leader. There's like we have with, I don't know, someone like Putin. We might not like him, but we kind of can't deny that he's got a kind of, There's a lot of personality there. There's a lot there somehow. Whereas these Federation presidents that we've seen on screen, you know, they often feel a bit more like sort of functionaries. I mean, Jarish Inyo, I think, even says in those episodes, you know, oh, I never sought this office. I never really wanted to be in charge. You know, I just sort of ended up with this job somehow. And that's kind of the feeling you get off him. You know, where are these kind of great, inspiring leaders? I mean, I guess maybe the closest we get is that kind of hint. I think there's on that sort of on-screen text in a Mirror Darkly, which is sort of whether it's considered canon or not is kind of up for grabs. But this idea that Jonathan Archer becomes a Federation president, well, you can kind of imagine with him there'd be a bit more charisma there. There'd be a bit more there somehow.
Do you know? I don't know. I watched Enterprise for 4 years. I didn't see that much charisma.
Oh, well, he was building up to it towards the end. In that penultimate episode, he gave a pretty good speech for once.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm just
you know, give him a few more years.
Taking the piss out of
that's Keith's invite on Walk 5, John, there, I think. But no, you are right, though. It would have been great if, you know, if Enterprise had lasted, you know, and it's one of those, it's one of those shows that more than likely would have depicted the Earth-Romulan War and then led into the Federation's, you know, beginning. It would have been great if you've had,
which is actually
a season almost
been done by the tie-in fiction. But first, Michael A. Martin and now Christopher L. Bennett have been continuing Enterprise's story. They first did the Romulan War, and then Christopher's been doing the Rise of the Federation novels that have been, you know, picking up on all the themes from Enterprise and building the Federation up and showing its earliest days.
Exactly, and it would have been great if on screen, almost, it would have been quite radical, but if you'd actually taken Archer off the bridge and had him in some sort of leadership role, you know, as an incumbent president or something like that, and actually had a season of him doing that kind of job, that would have been really interesting, you know, to take that kind of story. But it always seems like the characters who function in that same role that you would have a Martok or you would have a Shinzon or whatever, they always seem to be admirals. They always seem to be high-ranking admirals, like Admiral Ross or Admiral Forrest, or, you know, in Admiral Cornwall in Discovery. You know, they always seem to be these admiral figures. And I suppose, does that make sense? Because it's Starfleet is a military organization, or ultimately?
It does make sense in the sense that the main characters that we have are ship commanders. Their orders would come from the Admiralty. The Admiralty's orders are going to come from the president, but that's a chain of command thing. You know, the president isn't going to be dealing directly with starship captains any more than, to look at the current United States, the president is going to give orders to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who are then going to pass down the orders to their subordinates. In that sense, the fact that there hasn't been much interaction makes sense. Having said that, there's a lot of circumstances, particularly when major political things have been involved, both on Next Gen and Deep Space Nine, and on Discovery also, where you'd think there'd be something from the civilian government, you know, interacting with somebody, just because there's important stuff going on, whether it's a war with the Klingons in Discovery, whether it's the Dominion War on Deep Space Nine, whether it's a change in power in the Klingon Empire on Next Gen. These are all things where, you know, at least somebody from the Federation Council or a Federation ambassador should be involved. We've only, and having said that, of course, a Federation ambassador was involved in the change of power from Kimpek to Gowron, because we had Kalar, even though she got killed. And that was a rare case, and it was only because they wanted to bring Kalar back. But that was the sort of thing we should have been seeing more of. Even if it wasn't necessarily a Federation politician, we should have at least been seeing, diplomatic representation, not just military.
It struck me as quite strange that in that final episode of Discovery, we go to Paris, which we've kind of established is the kind of diplomatic, political heart of the Federation, I suppose. We're not in San Francisco. We're actually specifically in Paris. And yet what we see in that final scene is, Admiral Cornwall in charge. We hear that Burnham has had this presidential pardon, but we don't see the president. We don't see any of this kind of, this kind of political administration. Again, we only see Starfleet.
Do they maybe think that it's just not very interesting? And I suppose this is where it would have been, this is where to bring, to talk about the West Wing and something like that. I think, as articles showed, you can do some really good drama around that kind of setting, and wouldn't it be interesting to see a Star Trek show actually have the brevity to sort of include that aspect as part of its, as part of its story, and have, some element of it set on Earth, or even, it wouldn't even have to be on Earth. It could be a diplomatic, corps, including the president or whoever, on a ship, in part of a mission or something like that, and actually have that back and forth, have that, that interaction that you saw in articles, you see in the West Wing with all these various characters, chiefs of staff and, advisors and all these people, giving the president information and getting involved. I mean, I think that could be really good in terms of drama, and it could add a really new dimension, but they seem to, whenever you see politicians, they're like, I always think of that, that Deep Space Nine episode. It might be The Forsaken in season 1 where Luoxana Troy comes on board and the ambassadors are just awful. They're just awful people. They're just sarcastic and rude. And you just think, how on earth have you got to the position you have? You seem inept, and they never seem to give them any skills.
That's been a consistent trope in Star Trek. And it's one that I, in particular, after rewatching Next Gen Deep Space Nine in the original series for 5 years, it's an annoying trend in that they have a tendency to just have politicians of all sorts just be ignoramuses and annoying and just there to get in the way of our heroes, which is a lazy way of writing it, but it's an easy way to make your own characters look better, I guess. But I mean, even on the original series where you had like Ambassador Fox in A Taste of Armageddon, Nils Barris in The Trouble with Tribbles, who is a cabinet member. Ferris in the Galileo 7 is supposed to be an antagonistic character, but he's actually the one whose side I'm on. But because in that particular episode, he's trying to get medicine to people who need it, and Kirk decided to take a break to stare at a quasar for a few minutes. It's like, really, guys? Priorities, maybe. And I do want to rise to the defense a little bit of the president in Star Trek 6, who actually was, doing a good job of trying to balance all the different diplomatic needs of what was going on. Listening to he listened to all the different options that were presented to him, not just from his own people, but also from, the Romulan ambassador, from the Klingon ambassador, from Sarek, from Colonel West, and a lot of this is in the extended scenes that weren't in the theatrical release, but were on home video. Kurtwood Smith played him and you could see that he was trying very hard to balance and do the right thing. He wasn't as ineffectual as Jarrett was, and he wasn't as irrelevant as the president in Star Trek 4 was, who was really, he was just sort of there to be there. All he really got to do was warn people not to come to Earth, and then, pass sentence on the crew at the end, and that was pretty much it. It wasn't much of he didn't really have much of a presence. I gave him a name of Hiram Roth in articles and tried to give him a little more interesting history. And he's another one. He's another character who showed up a lot in the tie-in fiction, particularly in the comic book. The comic books that took place after Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 5 that were being done by DC. The president showed up a few times as a regular character.
But I think the guy in The Undiscovered Country, I suppose the reason he is a bit more interesting is that he's the virtuous one ultimately, isn't he? There's these conspirators in his own government, in his own ambassador corps and Admiral Cartwright and all these guys. So he's not the kind of president we later see in some of this time fiction with, Minzif and weak presidents, even not necessarily corrupt like Jarrett, but weak. He gives the impression he's fairly strong, but unfortunately this conspiracy has, been created around him. And it was interesting how you get to see a president like that in 1991, as the Cold War is coming to an end, and the Undiscovered Country is a very interesting film because of that, because Nicholas Meyer does actually get into the political side of it, and he does. And I suppose the other character who is consistently sort of characterized in that sense is Sarek, isn't he? Because all the way through he is an ambassador, and but then they don't really use him in that sense as much as Spock's dad, and having that emotional connection to Spock and all this kind of thing, emotional in Vulcan sense, but do you know what I mean? It's interesting that he fills that role as quite a virtuous, strong president, but unfortunately surrounded by people who are trying to, corrupt the system.
Well, they're soldiers who want to keep the war going, which is, another interesting, it's something you saw a lot of. It was a theme you saw a lot of throughout the 1990s, pretty much, as after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a very common thread in a lot of political fiction was, people who used to be, Cold Warriors, as it were, who were involved in the fight between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, who suddenly had nothing to do, or had to change the way they did things, and were struggling with that transition. And that was this, the Undiscovered Country was going for the same theme of that. And how do you readjust when the political landscape changes? How do you adjust? Which is that's not something Star Trek has dealt with much on screen, although you did see it with Cardassia, really, because they had the major fallout from the Obsidian Order being wiped out, because that was literally half their government.
I think it's kind of significant that in the Undiscovered Country, you see the president kind of doing presidential stuff in a way, whereas the president in Star Trek 4 is really, I suppose he is kind of chairing the council at the beginning and at the end to some extent, but that feels like that feels like a fairly sort of functional role somehow. He's not really making big decisions. Even the pardon. I mean, we had this idea of the presidential pardon. I mean, that's one of the kind of, in the American system anyway, that's one of the kind of great, powers that the president has, isn't it, in a way? I mean, I was just, rewatching a bit of The West Wing, and the very last episode of The West Wing hinges on this question of whether the president, as his kind of final act in the last few minutes of his presidency, is going to, pardon. This is a spoiler, by the way, for anyone who hasn't seen The West Wing. It's going to pardon Toby Ziegler for what he's done. And that kind of idea that the president has this kind of power. I mean, it's interesting, talking about legality and the president not being above the law and so on. In a sense, by having the power of pardon, the president can kind of circumvent the law. But in Star Trek 4, it's interesting. The presidential pardon at the end of that film is described as a council pardon, that they have decided on it together. This idea of they've thrown out most of the charges. They decided to demote Captain Kirk, which again, actually, you would think would be demoting an admiral. You'd think would be a Starfleet matter, not a kind of civilian matter. So it's all a bit murky somehow, that whole thing. But I don't know. I just sort of thought that's interesting. So again, he feels very much like he's just sort of the spokesperson for this council almost. Whereas in Star Trek 6, we see him in his office. He's taking meetings with the ambassadors. He's kind of making decisions. He's this quite inspirational character making this speech at the end. He survives an assassination attempt. So I suppose, although we don't get to know all that much about him as a person, we sort of see him being quite presidential, doing quite kind of, recognizably presidential things, even if that's being shot at and nearly dying in a dramatic fashion. It kind of, it makes him feel more presidential somehow that he goes through all of that.
And Jarish, at least we see him in office and making decisions. He winds up being, he's been manipulated by the corrupt elements of Starfleet, by I'm blanking.
Admiral Layton. Admiral Layton, wasn't it?
I was thinking Admiral Foxworth. No, that's the actor.
It's close.
But at the very least, we see him in office making decisions and trying to, do his job. But as with Rigor Trey in Star Trek 6, he's unfortunately being done in by corrupt elements. And I don't know, it feels like it's a lost opportunity, particularly on Deep Space Nine, to have not seen a president beyond that two-parter. At the very least, in what you leave behind, the Federation president should be there during the signing of the armistice, and all we saw were Starfleet personnel, which didn't make any sense. Like I said, it's part and parcel of being, dealing of a show that deals with the people in the field in the military. How often does, the commander of a army platoon deal with the president of the United States? It doesn't happen that often. But every once in a while, like you said, a recurring character. I'm thinking, or even just, more mention of the influence. I'm thinking of Babylon 5, where President Clark, we only saw President Clark once, maybe. But that character had a presence and an influence that affected what was going on. That was actually a particularly good use of that type of character and how the people on the ground would interact in the the influence of it, if not necessarily the direct physical presence. Because
he was essentially like a Hitler, wasn't he? Basically, he was a fascist, leader who a lot of people wouldn't have seen up, close. The fact that we didn't see Clark very much made him scarier in a way, made him more of a threat, because he was just this monolithic sort of idea, this person who had these, this immense amount of force behind him, but you didn't see him. But he was, like you said, he was pervasive in Babylon 5. He was always there. He was always he was mentioned all the time. He was,
until he was killed anyway.
Whereas, well, yeah, exactly, yeah. but and I don't even, did we even see that? I don't even know if you even saw him die.
I'm pretty sure that was all off camera. But
yeah, which is
it's been a while since it's been 20 years, but
same. But it was fascinating because they didn't even need to show that. It wasn't directly about him, but he was important to the story, and that's what, like you say, the president should have been there at the end in what you leave behind, because it was the whole idea of the Allies in Berlin, wasn't it, basically? And and it would have been really interesting to see the three, a bunch of world leaders, actually there. It would have been interesting to see that. And because ultimately, you mentioned it earlier, Duncan, when you were talking about the council and some of the decisions. It's important to remember the Federation was really, in many ways, born out of crisis. It came off the back of this massive interstellar war, which Earth nearly lost. And then they brought together a union to think to think in the, in a very forward thinking way and try and create something, better. But the Federation came off the back of something a bit like the United Nations. It came off the back of something that was meant as a healer, to past wars and past, destruction, this kind of thing, to sort of give them a new mission statement. So there's a very clear parallel between, them coming, this group of people coming together. In the UN, it was nations. In this case, it's it's worlds. So the president almost doesn't have the same, sense of persona and power that a chancellor of the Klingon Empire would, I suppose, or a praetor of the Romulan Senate, that kind of thing. Maybe that's one of the differences.
Well, they make that remark in, I think it's in Homefront, don't they? Where they say basically that, the president of the Federation is not human and therefore is not going to care as much about Earth as humans do. So I suppose there is that sense, and I suppose, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, Keith, with your book articles, the kind of West Wing parallels are impossible to miss. But I suppose also there's this sort of question with the Federation. Is it run like a kind of American political system? Is it run like the UN? I mean, you talk about there being a Security Council, which obviously is something, we know we have it with the UN. What's the kind of model?
Because I was going for something that was kind of a combination of some of the better elements of the US, the UK, and the UN.
That's interesting.
There were some very, parliamentary aspects of it, and there were very republic aspects of it, similar to the U.S. model, which was partly based on what we'd already seen. There was a president and a council, and the council, obviously, at least based on what the mentions of it, has a certain amount of power, and different committees and councils and such. I didn't want to just go for a one-to-one analog of the U.S. model, because that would be lazy and not really in keeping with the whole idea of a united Earth rather than the United States taking over the Earth. Which was, the whole idea originally of Star Trek was that it was a united Earth. That was what was so radical about it in 1966, was that you had not only the good old fashioned white Americans, but you also had the Asians and Russians and people of different skin colors all serving together, and nobody commented on it. That, people who were seeing us fight, they would turn on the news and see the U.S. fighting a war against people who look like Mr. Sulu, and civil rights unrest from people who looked like Lieutenant Uhura, and fighting a Cold War against people who sounded like Ensign Chekhov, and yet here they were all working together, all good friends, being happy, and nobody comments on that or the fact that the science officer has pointed ears. That was and the idea that it was the entire Earth coming together. So I wanted the government to be representative of more than one different style of government sort of combined, which is in keeping with the Federation. There are even some elements of the Roman Senate in there, in how I was putting it together, and hopefully succeeded. But it's the sort of thing that was fascinating to me to look at, because it's not something that the shows really even needed to deal with. But I wanted to, again, one of the advantages of tie-in fiction is that we can show things that you don't necessarily get from the source material, particularly a tie-in line as robust and as lengthy as Star Trek's, there's a lot of room to do different things, whether it's, Garak's autobiography or, books based on other ships, whether it's a Klingon ship or Picard's time on the Stargazer or Vanguard or Titan or whatever, or New Frontier, that doesn't tie directly into an existing show, or to do, something like articles like the Section 31 books that Dave Mack did, like, for that matter, another. It wasn't really a sequel to Articles of the Federation, but it was sort of a spiritual successor, was a book called A Singular Destiny, which picked up on Dave Mack's Destiny trilogy, and showing just what the greater impact of what happened in that trilogy was on the Federation and the galaxy as a whole. Whereas other novels dealt with the specifics of how the crews were familiar with, dealt with it. The object with A Singular Destiny was to show the broader implications and also set up future stories with the Typhon Pact and whatnot. Articles of the Federation, while it is probably one of my best reviewed novels and one that is generally liked by people who read it, wasn't a particularly big seller. It was, because it was sort of an odd duck in Trek Lit, even by our weird standards. While it was well received by people who bought it, a lot of people didn't buy it in the first place. But what has been heartening to me is how influential it's become, because in the 24th century that's been written since then, which has all been, basically linked, Articles has continued to be the template for how to write the Federation government. The Federation government has been involved in a lot of the things, whether it's, the Borg invasion in the Destiny trilogy, dealing with the Typhon Pact in those books, and so on. So it's really gratifying to me how much there was an album that was released in 1968 called Music from Big Pink. It was by a group called The Band. And the average rock and roll fan may not know that album, but you ask almost any rock and roll musician who was working in the late 60s and early 70s and all the way up into the 80s, they will likely list Music from Big Pink as a major influence on them as musicians. And Articles has sort of become the Music from Big Pink of the Star Trek novel field. It's like not everybody's read it necessarily, but it's had this major impact on how the fiction has been written, and it's very gratifying to me. Not the least of which is because President Baco is at least partly based on my late great grandmother, who died the year before I introduced the character in A Time for War, Time for Peace, and was meant as a tribute to her. So the fact that she became such a major character, she appeared in something like a dozen novels after Articles. I would have been happy if she just got mentioned once or twice and she turned into this major supporting character. So that was really gratifying. And I hope, it's my hope that, going forward, it's the sort of thing that people might, take into account. I was I forget which one of you said it, but one of you mentioned that it was disappointing that they mentioned a presidential pardon in Discovery and they were in Paris, but we didn't actually see any of that. And that would have been a nice thing to see. And I'm hoping that moving forward, Discovery might give us the opportunity to show that in action, especially since one of the staff writers on Discovery is Kirsten Beyer, who is familiar with the novel line, having been written in it for a while and having written President Baco herself in one of her Voyager novels. So we'll see.
It's interesting, though. We've talked a little bit about the limited number of Federation presidents that we have seen on screen, and how maybe in some cases they didn't quite live up to expectations. I mean, Tony, you and I were talking a little while ago about Michael Piller's book Fade In, which details the kind of creative process behind Star Trek Insurrection. And in one of his earliest drafts, or one of his earliest treatments for that film, he had this character of the Federation president who was a Vulcan, who he wanted to be played by Ian McKellen, and he wanted Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen to be squaring off in the Federation, in the Council or the Senate or whatever, and to have these kind of big political debates. And this was the thing that got nixed by Rick Berman, because he basically said, "Oh, this is all just boring. I'm not interested." So it kind of made me think, if we had seen that version of Insurrection put up on the screen, would that have been our kind of defining image of, I mean, as it turned out, a kind of morally dubious president, but certainly if you had Ian McKellen playing this Federation president, you'd get, you'd get a big performance there. You'd get someone quite interesting, that would have kind of added to that. And, it's a shame really that we didn't ever get to see that version of that story.
Yeah, no, it is really. And I think it's possibly indicative of the time, I mean, the question is whether or not you would, in this day and age, you would find, the writers interested enough to, to write these kind of characters and to include this aspect into the, because obviously, some of the articles came off the back of, the West Wing and its success during those years, so, that kind of political show is really popular.
And it's continued to be. You've got Madam Secretary, you've got
House of Cards.
What's it? Designated Survivors, you've got House of Cards, you've got, for that matter, even, 24, always, presidential politics were a big part of 24 as well. All in the 20 years since the West Wing debuted. I don't think we've ever had a period where there wasn't a show on the air where the President of the United States wasn't at least a supporting character.
And especially now, given how, even more than Obama, the current president is in the news every single day, across the world. Not always for the best. In fact, not often for the best, but, he's unavoidable. And I think it would be fascinating to see Star Trek, it's worked hard with Discovery to try and reflect, this growing sense of unease about where we're heading as a society, with the rise of the far right and things like that, with the mirror universe, doing so much with that, it's managed to comment on the current day, and, you could say that, Emperor Giorgio being this, hardline sort of far right sort of leader, I suppose, in some respects is a commentary, but there's more of an interesting sort of idea I think they could bring into something like Discovery. So you kind of hope that they would have the guts to do that, I think, in this day and age.
I was just thinking, it's interesting. Talking about the West Wing, I'm not sure really whether that was a bit of a sea change in itself, because I suppose what's significant about the West Wing, and I think this comes across in Keith's book articles as well, is this sense that, these are good people. They're kind of idealistic people. They're doing their best. They're compromising a bit here and there. There are a few rough edges in terms of personalities and so on, but it's quite a kind of inspiring thing. And I was thinking in terms of, say, earlier kind of political series that come to mind for me, certainly in Britain, things like Yes Minister, House of Cards, House of Cards, as in the current American remake, is a very cynical attitude to politics. Everyone is self-serving and, if not murderous and evil. Yes Minister, the political setup is the politicians are basically buffoons and idiots and don't know what they're doing, and they need someone else to kind of do everything for them. I suppose what was interesting about the West Wing was that everyone was at the top of their game. Everyone was, absolutely, they were doing things for the right reasons, even if they might disagree about what exactly was the right thing to do. It was quite Star Trek in that sense. It was quite idealistic. And it also had this interesting thing. I was thinking when we were talking about, the president doesn't necessarily need to be in every episode, or the president doesn't need to be a main character or whatever. The original idea for the West Wing, was that the president would barely be in it. He would be a kind of a cameo. And watching, I went back, my kind of research for this episode of Primitive Culture was, I didn't have time to go and rewatch the whole West Wing, but I watched the first episode and I watched the last episode. And watching that first episode, it's kind of amazing because what you have is, the president literally appears halfway through the final scene of that episode. The whole of the rest of the setup is all about the staff. It's it's almost the lower decks in a kind of Star Trek concept, or not quite the lower decks, but not seeing the actual absolute top. And then he just comes in for like 5 minutes at the end and kind of gives this, remarkable performance and kind of wipes the floor with everyone and kind of swans out. And you can kind of see why from then on they basically bumped his character up a bit and decided to do more with him. But it's kind of interesting, that idea that you can tell that story, and that pilot in itself tells a very effective story, with the president kind of being the person that everyone is talking about, but you're almost never seeing. Do you know what I mean? Because he's always off in another room doing something on the phone to some world leader or whatever it is. You don't necessarily have to see it all.
Change just from the sheer power of Martin Sheen's awesomeness.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is it. Yeah. This is it. We just need, Nania Tobacco to appear now and get an amazing actress to come in and make it happen. But
one of the running gags on the Trek BBS has always been, especially, it was at its height, obviously, in the mid 2000s when A Time for Peace and Articles of the Federation came out, but it's continued on and off since then. Is trying to cast President Baco, and I have a very clear image in my head of what she's supposed to look like, which doesn't actually match any existing actor. But some have come close. And there've been some good suggestions.
Who knows? Maybe we'll get it one day.
I'm not holding my breath, but I will.
You never know. Yeah. Strange things have happened. But no, it's been an interesting discussion, hacking through the politics and the presidents. And Keith, we don't normally do a sign-off as such, but given you're a special guest, do you want to point people to where they can find out about what you're working on right now and where's best to find you on the social media?
Best bet is to go to my website, which is at DeCandido.net. Right now, it's just kind of a link dump, but that's eventually I'm going to spruce it up a little bit more. But right now, if you go to DeCandido.net, it'll point you at my blog, which I update fairly regularly, my presence on both Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. It links you to my articles on Tor.com, including the various Star Trek rewatches. I also reviewed every episode of Discovery as they came out, so that's up there as well. And there's also an email link there and links to my most recent works of fiction. So that's your best bet. Just go there, and that'll give you all your complete guide to cyber stalking me can be found at DeCandido.
That's perfect. That's great. And obviously, talking about Federation presidents and the political spectrum and who might play Nania Tobacco one day isn't the only thing that's happening on Trek FM right now. So here's a little look at what else is happening right now on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
Also, and this might be me reading way too much into this, but I feel like because Tilly ends up being so instrumental in what happens later in the mirror universe, part of me when I was reading this wondered if in the back of my mind Stamets is like, I need to have one person, and Lorca's like, oh, I want to make my own oh, Tilly, that's who you want. Yeah, okay, sure.
To the journey!
This is Jeff Foxworthy, You Might Be a Redneck If.
Oh, Lord.
If you fall in love with a hologram,
you might be in a doomed relationship.
If you fall in love and it never really happened,
you might be in a doomed relationship.
If you fall in love with someone manipulative,
you might be in a doomed relationship.
If you can't even remember your own name,
you're definitely in a doomed relationship.
The Orb.
So I'm going to destroy your computers. So if you want to fight, you're going to have to use real bombs. I hope you're ready because I'm leaving. You figure it out. But of course, trailing the Enterprise is always the Starfleet cleanup ship that comes in and cleans up the mess.
Yeah, the USS Broomsweep.
Right, the USS Broomsweep.
Standard orbit.
Can we not just go to just a planet and everybody has dark complexion and it's not a thing? It's not like a crux of the story, right? That would have been, I think that would have been true progress. And when it's not even like, oh, well, since we're going to this planet, we have to talk about race. That's the whole point of the whole story. It serves the story well, but I don't think that's a prerequisite to have a story like this.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM, that's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You blend it all.